The following creepypasta that you are about to hear is not real. These are made-up creepypastas that I write myself. Thank you, and have a good day. I woke up this morning, ate my breakfast, got dressed, brushed my teeth, and started walking to school. And while I was walking to school, the only thing I could think about was how weird yesterday was. Our substitute teacher, Mr. Cottard, was much different than the other substitute teachers I've had. To put it simply, he was weird. Especially when he yelled out that the bathroom isn't real. I sighed, hoping that Mr. Glenn already recovered from his sickness and that I can finally forget about that weird substitute. When I got to school, I waited for the bell to ring so we can go inside. While I stood on the tarmac waiting, Robert ran up to me. "Hey Clyde, did you hear? Mr. Cottard is subbing for Mr. Glenn for the rest of this week." "What?" I replied in disbelief, with my hopes of being able to forget about Mr. Cottard disintegrating. "There's no way Mr. Glenn is that sick," I continued. "Yeah, well, apparently he is. But hey, we get an interesting week out of it," Robert responded. "Yep, you got that right," I quietly said as Robert was sniggering to himself, quietly repeating what Mr. Cottard said the day before about the bathroom not being real. The bell rang, and we all went inside. I walked to the classroom with my other classmates and noticed that what Robert told me was right. Mr. Glenn was still sick, and Mr. Cottard was sitting at Mr. Glenn's desk doing some paperwork. I sat down and waited patiently for class to begin, as all of my other classmates talked loudly. Mr. Cottard got up from Mr. Glenn's desk and got the class's attention. "Everybody quiet," Mr. Cottard commanded. "Today we'll be working extra hard, but if we work hard enough, we can do another Cottard space." The class sighed, but Mr. Cottard didn't say anything about it. He simply went over to his desk and handed out worksheets to all the students. And like the previous day, the questions on this worksheet were rather strange. There were questions such as, "What do you think started all existence?" and "What do you think you will see after you die?" But the last question really stood out to me. "Do you believe in God?" I sat back in my seat. How was I supposed to answer that? Yes, I do believe in God, but not in the kind of way in which I would go to church every Sunday and pray every night before bed. I just believe in God, and that's all there is to it. I looked over at Robert, and he looked just as surprised and confused as me. "Hey Robert, you on the last question?" I asked quietly, hoping that Mr. Cottard didn't hear me. Yeah, it's just... How do you answer that?" Robert asked in confusion. It was soon time for Mr. Cottard to collect the worksheets. When they were collected, he went back to Mr. Glenn's desk and looked them over. I kept a close eye on Mr. Cottard. He flipped through each one, scanning the page for correct and incorrect answers, marking them as he went through. Eventually he finished marking the papers, shook his head, got up, and walked to the front of the class. "Class, why didn't any of you answer the last question?" There was silence for a while, with several classmates making uneasy and uncomfortable expressions. "Class, I believe that every question is important, and it's important for every question to have an answer. So why didn't any of you write anything down on the last question?" Mr. Cottard asked again, still patiently waiting for a response. One kid, Mason, spoke up. "Well, it's a pretty weird question," Mason explained. "A pretty weird question?" Mr. Cottard asked. "Well, yeah. Well, Mason, this is for your learning, and you need to answer questions regardless of how weird they are. Got that?" Mr. Cottard asked. "Yeah," Mason said quietly. Mr. Cottard simply looked at us for a second. He shook his head, then spoke out. "Well, class, let's just have another Cottard space." Mr. Cottard began writing on the blackboard, but the options today were different than the previous day's options. Today, there were only 3 options for us kids to choose: the sun, microorganisms, and the human brain. When Mr. Cotter was done, he called upon Robert to choose one of the things on the blackboard. I'll go with the sun, Robert said with unease. Great. What do you think it's made up of? Mr. Cotter asked. Well, I think it's made up of, hot gas, hydrogen, helium, and... Robert was cut off by Mr. Cotter. Wrong, Mr. Cotter said with a serious tone. What? Robert did just list off some of the things that actually do make up the sun. But why was Mr. Cotter telling him he was wrong? It isn't made up of any of those things. I personally think that the sun isn't made up of anything. It doesn't exist. Nor does any microorganism or the human brain. Nothing exists, Mr. Cotter explained calmly. At first, everyone was silent, but it was eventually broken with laughter. What? So nothing exists? Mason yelled over his laughter. This guy is delusional, I swear, Robert added. Mr. Cotter looked at the class and then turned his head over to me, seeing as I was the only kid who wasn't laughing. He shook his head and went over to Mr. Glenn's desk. Class! Mr. Cotter yelled. Surprisingly, the laughter slowly came to a stop. I honestly didn't expect that because they probably would have kept on laughing. But I guess they were thinking that he would say something else funny. Turn your heads away from my direction, and do not turn them back until I say so. Everyone in the room complied, and some were giggling, anticipating Mr. Cotter's next comedic action. But I didn't. I kept looking in Mr. Cotter's direction. I saw him open a drawer, and he pulled out what looked like to be the same red object I saw the previous day. But this time, it was blue instead of red. The object was a cylinder shape and had a white button on top of it, and a black, sensor-like circle on the bottom. Mr. Cotter looked at me, and pointed, mouthing at me to look the other way, but I just kept looking at him. He simply shook his head and raised the blue object above him, with his thumb on the white button and the black circle facing our direction. My eyes widened, primarily in confusion as to what was going to happen. Mr. Cotter pressed a button and told us that we can look back. My classmates immediately began looking as if they were confused. Some had their hands and fingers on their temples, and some were wheezing and groaning, as if they had just woken up. And I started getting a headache, and noticed changes in my vision. I became confused and started rubbing my temples. I began to sweat, and it was around this time when some of the kids began passing out on their desks. But I didn't notice. I was too confused to even know where I was. And then, everything went black. I slowly opened my eyes. How long was I out for? My head was pounding, and I looked at the clock and noticed that it was 12:24. It was almost lunchtime. I was now aware of my surroundings. I looked around and saw all of my other classmates pass out on their desks, and I was apparently the first to wake up. I looked at Mr. Cotter, who was sitting at Mr. Glenn's desk. Mr. Cotter, what did you do? I asked weakly. Mr. Cotter sighed. Listen, Clyde, I'll be honest with you. Because you were obviously looking at what I was doing and you obviously want to know what it was. So do not repeat this to anyone, Mr. Cotter explained. So what I did was that I used this little blue device to make you all pass out. Think of it as a form of hypoxia. I didn't respond. I was still rather groggy, and it was difficult to think straight at the time. You were the first one to wake up. Everyone else should wake up in a moment, and it's almost lunchtime, so you should get ready. And remember, do not repeat that to anyone. I got ready for lunch break and left the classroom. I didn't eat my lunch as my headache was still pretty bad. And while I sat in the cafeteria holding my hand against my head, a few of my friends from another class were worried. "Hey, Clyde, you alright, man?" I rose my head a little and noticed that my friend Jason, along with a few of his other friends, were looking at me with concern. "Clyde, seriously, did something happen in your class before lunch?" Jason asked again. Jason and his friends were from another class in our grade, so he didn't know anything about Mr. Carter and what he did. But I knew I couldn't talk about it, so I just explained that I just had a bad headache. "Oh well, I hope you get better soon," Jason explained in relief, now thinking it was just a headache, even though he was completely oblivious to what happened earlier. After lunch break, we had afternoon recess. My headache had actually gotten a bit better by then, but I still just ended up sitting on a bench most of the time. While sitting on the bench, I noticed that some of my classmates started coming out of the school building. A few of them, James and Robert, came up to me. "Hey, Clyde, do you know what happened?" Robert asked with his hand on his head. "Yeah, man, this headache's killing me," James added. I took a deep breath. "I can't tell you guys," I said firmly. James and Robert just stood there for a second. What do you mean you can't tell us?" Robert asked. "I said I can't tell you guys." "Just don't ask again," I explained. "Well, fine. Man, what got into you?" Robert asked as he and James walked off. I sat on the bench for a few more minutes until I saw the principal out supervising. I thought I can trust him. He has more authority than Mr. Coddard after all, and he's overall someone I can trust. And after a few moments of hesitation, I finally got up and walked up to the principal, Mr. Ross. Hey, Mr. Ross, I need to tell you something," I explained. "Sure, Clyde. What is it?" Mr. Ross replied. We have a substitute who's been filling in for Mr. Glenn and, well, he knocked all of us out before lunch." I saw Mr. Ross's eyes widen as he listened further to what I had to say. He took out this little blue device and told us to. I was cut off when I saw Mr. Ross's head jerk slightly, and his eyes rolling to the back of his head. Mr. Ross just stood, unresponsive, making slight jerking motions. Mr. Ross, are you okay?" I asked in concern. Mr. Ross didn't respond in any way. He just continued to act this way until his eyes finally returned to their normal position, and he smiled. "Clyde, don't worry about it. We'll handle it," Mr. Ross said reassuringly. He then walked off. I found this strange because normally when something bad happens, Mr. Ross is usually very tense and serious, but now he's calm and reassuring. I slowly went back to the bench and sat down on it, still trying to comprehend what just happened. This wasn't normal. Something strange was going on, and I continued to think about it until the bell rang, signaling that it was time to go back inside. I got up, went back into the building, and went back to my classroom. I sat down on my desk and looked around, and some of my classmates were still relatively confused, and some still had their headaches, but luckily mine has died down quite a bit, so I didn't dwell on it too much. I watched as Mr. Cotter wrote something on the blackboard, and he turned around to face the class, revealing the word existent written on the blackboard. "Alright, class, I'd like you to define the word existent for me." Nobody raised their hand to answer, either because they still couldn't think straight or they just didn't want to get involved, or because they were quietly talking to their friends and making jokes about Mr. Cottard. After a few seconds, I raised my hand. "Clyde," Mr. Cottard said as he pointed to me. I took a second before speaking. Something that's real? I slowly explained. Yes, Mr. Cotter called. Existent is something that is real. Mr. Cotter took a deep breath. You assume that everything around you is real, and that's normal. Besides, there isn't any evidence that it isn't real. At least, not that you've seen. My classmates looked very confused as to what Mr. Cotter was talking about, and were awaiting further explanation. Throughout the remainder of this week, I'll be teaching all of you the truth, Mr. Cotter announced. What truth? What the hell was this guy talking about? I looked around the room only to notice that the other kids were just as clueless as I am. What's that supposed to mean? Robert blurted. Mr. Cotter looked at him. I'm talking about the truth. The truth about our lives, and why we're here, Mr. Cotter explained. One of my classmates let out the sound of him trying to hold in a laugh, to which Mr. Cotter faced his direction. Enough with the laughter. I know you all think this is funny, but the laughing is over. So from now on, you will sit down, shut the hell up, and learn what I'm teaching you. The entire class was silent. Nobody spoke or laughed. Nobody whispered to their friends, and nobody moved. Mr. Cotter began lecturing about how life isn't what we think it is and that God doesn't exist. My eyes widened when he said that, and so did a few other kids who were probably questioning why he was saying these things. He went on about how memories were just experiences that never happened, and that there's nothing but darkness beyond our vision. And when school ended at 3 o'clock, Mr. Cotter explained that he would teach us more tomorrow, and we left. I walked home and thought about everything Mr. Cotter said today. And at dinner, I simply stared at my food, thinking, questioning. I didn't get much sleep that night. I laid in bed until at least 12. I thought about everything and trying to come up with an explanation, but was never able to think of one. But the only thing I could think of was who the hell was this guy?